Welcome back. You're watching Global Today here on Morning Prime, and we continue with the conversation on the Ukraine crisis and, of course, racism, and also that is affecting Africa and Kenya as well. You have the information from the CS of Agriculture that the fertilizer is about to go up because of the conflict in Ukraine at the end of the day. And what this really means, your food also will be affected. The prices will go up at the end of the day. So we are feeling the heat as a country, but we are actually also looking deeply on what is being raised in terms of racism. I promised to circle back with Dr. Peter Biarajak all the way from Washington, D.C. Peter, good morning again, or good evening on your side. Right, you comment on the Ukraine, and of course you've been following the developments with why Africans. We have Kenyans as well there who were trying to get into the trains, some of them to leave the country, and they were not given that opportunity. Only whites, no blacks, because we have someone here who's saying that no blacks are allowed right now, no English, no Polish, no blacks. They told my friend, this is what Christian, who received a video call from his friend Winston from the Medica border crossing, where he claimed to have seen Ukrainian military personnel preventing hundreds of Africans and other international citizens from going to Poland. He has been waiting to receive Winston, a Nigerian national, in Poland, but has not been able to contact him on the phone. He fears that his battery has died, or worse. No English, no Polish, no blacks, they told my friend. Your reaction?
It's very disturbing, Dubal. And let me start by saying that racism is a disease that we have all seen all over the world. Even in this country that I live in the United States, racism is a big problem. It has been there since the foundation of this country, which was born at the time when there was slavery. It is continuing up to today. Even though the United States has had a black president, I'm very sure many Americans, especially Black Americans, feel racism here. But Dubal, when you leave the United States and you begin to go to the rest of the world, then the problem of racism becomes even more problematic. Even in Western Europe, as you know, I did my PhD in England. And even there, although they have interacted with us for hundreds of years, you still feel it. But as Dr. said it before, it gets really worse when you get towards.
Right, you seem to have lost Peter Biarajak there. We'll try and reconnect with him as well to also just get his thoughts as well. But let me just gravitate this particular discussion also to a more interesting and developing story there regarding the nuclear submarines, where Russians' nuclear submarines sail off for drills in the Barents Sea, and mobile missile launchers roamed snow forest on Tuesday in Siberia after President Vladimir Putin ordered his nation's nuclear forces to put on high alert over the tensions with the West over the invasion of Ukraine. Russia's Northern Fleet said in a statement that several of its nuclear submarines were involved in exercises designed to train maneuvering in stormy conditions. It said several warships tasked with protecting northwest Russia's Kola Peninsula, where several naval bases are located, will join the maneuvers. In Irkutsk region of the eastern Siberia, units of the Strategic Missile Forces dispersed years intercontinental ballistic missile launchers in forests to practice secret deployment, the Defense Ministry said in a statement. The military didn't say whether the drills were linked to Putin's order on Sunday to put the country's nuclear forces on high alert amid Russia's war in Ukraine. It also was unclear whether the exercises presented a change in the country's normal nuclear training activities or posture. Dr. Hassan Kaneja, on this particular development, people were saying this is just a posturing of Vladimir Putin. He will not really, launch any nuclear weapon, as it were. But right now we can see the drills are on, sending shivers, bugbears and shivers down the line. So should we be worried about these particular drills? The latest development. We know right now also Chernobyl has been captured by, of course, the Russian forces, as it were. And we know the history of Chernobyl nuclear power plant at the end of the day, briefly.
Yeah, well, of course, Chernobyl was captured. You know, it is a dysfunctional thing. It's not like it's actually something that is active. Of course, we remember, you know, way back in '86 where it had the, I think, the world's, you know, worst nuclear accident. Now, much of it is actually, you know, posturing by Russia, but it's not exactly posturing as it is in terms of trying to send a message to the West that for the first time you've seen countries such as Germany actually arm forces out there, you know, that are in conflict, you know, going against its traditional policy that has lasted for a very long time. But then increasingly, for the first time, you see NATO is actually supplied around, you know, 70 jets, the Su-25s and MiG-29 to Ukraine. And right now, I think Ukrainian pilots are picking them up, you know, to fly them to Kyiv. Now, that's a dangerous escalation on its own. Now, while I'm not sure to the extent to which Putin expected this kind of response, but I'm sure he did expect response. Now, I just want to put something clear. Putin is doing what Putin has said he will do, and that is not allowing a hostile country on its door. Much the same case like Washington could not have allowed the Soviet Union to position its missiles in Cuba because it changes the strategic balance of forces and it tends to increase you know, insecurity of the other country. It's a security dilemma. Now, and to our Western friends, you know, I do not think anyone in their right mind actually thinks that perhaps Moscow is going to be comfortable with actually creating a hostile in Ukraine. And what we're doing, and especially those of us, you know, who believe in the free world of freedom and democracy, is we are pushing Ukraine in a place that's going to lose either way, forcing them to choose sides. You see, in history, you can choose friends, but you can't choose your neighbors. And so perhaps the way forward, and especially in the negotiations that are coming, it's a degree in which, or a possibility that Ukraine can at least agree to being neutral in a way, but also be you know, for Moscow to guarantee its sovereignty, so it does not make it a, you know, playing field. But in the absence of such concessions, and if Moscow continues to actually feel insecure, it's going to be very difficult. Now, I don't see this as a Putin problem. I see this as any potential leader who is actually going to be in Russia. That is how they're going to look at the world, especially with regard to their sphere of influence. Unless someone is not a student of international relations, we don't get into this moralism. We don't even moralize international relations. We have to be practical. And I know we've all got into this bandwagon of sanctimonious righteousness, especially that comes from certain quarters, when precedence has been set for much of the last 2-3 decades. There's been an increasing unilateralism by the big powers in the world and has actually paved way for what we are seeing here, the flagrant violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries.
Nomidamba.
Well, I want to make several points. One is the intelligence have been very closely monitoring Putin mindset. And it's very dangerous because it's a kind of person who doesn't back off, and two, he does not trust anyone. And therefore, one has to really watch that very carefully. Putin has now been isolated, and he also underestimated the come together of the Western power, which is now. He has underestimated the world reaction toward what he was going to do. And therefore, at this point, he's a very dangerous person. What Russia has is an incredible arsenal of nuclear power. The US and the West has overwhelming power. There is no question about it. So it's come to confrontation 101. You know, Russia will sink, but Russia will do a lot of damage, which will impact the entire world the way we know it. What has happened, I was calculating, Putin has been in power for 19 years as a president and 4 years as a prime minister. That's the longest since the post-World War. And so Putin has been in power one day more than he need to be. And he basically turned himself to a czar who has all the control. Even oligarchies, these colleagues in oligarchy, are isolating him. You can see the kind of table that is set to meet with the people. It's not a normal kind of person. Nevertheless, Biden has to be very careful. This is the time that Biden needs to put a team of people behind the scene to try to connect with Putin and get him back and not continue to isolate him and begin to negotiate. I agree with my colleague Kananje that there is need to be neutrality so that we can save the sovereignty of Ukraine and then make sure that none, either the NATO or Russia, has a dominant power over Ukraine. This is the kind of settlement that will make sense.
So from Peter Kagwanja, should we be having any niggling worries as far as this nuke threat is concerned?
I think the reason why the Cold War ended, and ended the way it ended peacefully, was because it was beginning to become nonsense to talk about armament. Because when you have the capacity to destroy the world 5 times over or 10 times over, what is the need? The moment we get in the nuclear part, then I think Putin is just reminding you that it's not an ordinary power, you know, Ukraine versus Russia. We can extend this to the world and we destroy the whole world. And the lesson is going straight to Capitol Hill and other places that you are not talking about a normal power. I think that's the point, you know, Putin wants to make. But on another note, I listened to my brother, Professor Midaba, on how roguish, how, you know, uncompromising, how Hitler-like Putin is. But it's good to be fair to countries. I don't trust. I have never, advocated unilateral or even multilateral intervention in countries unless it is absolutely necessary. But this is a country that feels that it is thoroughly threatened. NATO has violated its terms of engagement with Russia when it was disbanding, and has continued to get one country after another in its formation. Why is NATO recruiting states to itself? Who is the enemy? This is what Russia is asking. Who is the enemy? And now when you get the country that historically is part of Russia, Ukraine historically, from those who study the history of Russia, has been part of it. So
All right, allow me just to interject a bit, because we have live pictures there that is coming through right now. The Kenya Wildlife Service Director General, Brigadier Retired Johnson Waweru, in one kind of a visit this morning to the Standard Group headquarters, and has landed at the group's helipad in Green Park, and will shortly join our colleagues from our sister station, Spice FM, during the Situation Room, where they will engage about tourism and wildlife. Just to, of course, our viewers can see that, and also there are listeners also on Spice FM just looking at tourism. That is the current state of play as well.
KTN News. Get the whole story.
Government forgotten Kenya's universities.
The government is fully supporting all the universities in the country.
Right now, it seems like education is a privilege in Kenya.
Students don't have the luxury of getting an increased school fees because if you increase the school fees, they have nowhere to go and borrow that money.
Is there a chance that the country's public universities can innovate ways to finance themselves, or is it just a long shot?
Let's get connected.
Your quarter acre, half acre, 1 acre, 5 acres and beyond. Deposit or place an installment of 590k on any of Optiven's projects and get an instant 15k cashback. Call us on 0790 300 300. Kwa mua maono yako na Optiven. KTN News. Get the whole story.
Welcome back. Of course, that was the DG of KWS who is coming to our studios here at Spice FM. Right, we continue with the discussion. Let me just go back to Peter Kagwanja. I'm sorry about that interruption. I hope you've not really lost your track of thought, sir.
Just telling you that it is interesting how students are more important than their teachers. You didn't show the public that I had arrived and my student just show up. Brigadier Waweru is my PhD student at the University of Nairobi, and he has disrupted my thoughts. So that's good enough. Karibu sana, welcome to him. Now, I think we had finished the thought. We were simply saying that I don't think the threat of nuclear is to Ukraine, because Ukraine can be defeated without nuclear. It is to tell the world, to remind the world that Russia has the capacity to destroy the world 5 times over, and therefore there is no need to interfere in Ukraine, that Russia should be allowed to finish its job. But I was also arguing that NATO has much to blame for this, largely because it went beyond the call of its duty to start recruiting other countries, particularly in the former Soviet zone. It's a way of growing its muscle. But the big question has been, for who? And when you look at, Russia on this side and China on the other, the West seems to be having what we're calling the pivot to the East and now the pivot to the West. And this pivoting is itself responsible for what we are now theorizing as the new Cold War. And who is responsible for this Cold War? So Ukraine again becomes a victim of this crash, and it is important to talk about safeguarding the sovereignty of Ukraine, at the same time reigning in NATO. If Russia abandoned the Warsaw Pact and decided to live peacefully without a war formation, why should we still continue to have NATO? I mean, what actually is the need for NATO in our global security system? It is the only indicator that the West is determined to maintain a hegemonic world order. And we have the United Nations. Why do we need NATO?
Right, why do we need NATO? And that is it's a poignant question that I think also when we go back and plumb deeper on what is happening with the crisis in Russia and Ukraine right now, there's a violation of a pact that we know as well, and I'll be whipping that momentarily to just discuss it as well. But let me just hear from Hashi, in regard to that, as we're closing up now on the nuclear threat briefly, and then we'll go all the way to also Dr. Peter Bierajak on, I think we disconnected with him because of technical challenges. We'll just have him back as well. Hashi, briefly, then we go to Peter Bierajak.
At a profound level, I think it's really important for us to know, and I think the Americans ought to know, that most of Asia and most of Africa are sympathetic to Putin. The reason that they are sympathetic to Putin, Dibal, is when I was in primary school here and we were being taught English by Irish nuns, I was taught a word called comeuppance. This is a word that probably not being taught anymore in primary school, but we were taught English properly. The comeuppance, Dibal, is the feeling that they got it coming, that NATO had this coming, and Ukraine is a victim that has been sandwiched between the bear and the eagle. And it has become a sandwich for the great powers. It's a really unfortunate situation in international relations. But Debal, there is such a thing as liberal hegemony in the world. And this unilateralism today has come to its graveside in the borders of Russia and Ukraine. And the American government's abandonment of its ally in the Ukraine is a testament to the cowardly nature of abandonment by Western powers when push comes to shove. We all also feel, all of Asia and all of Africa feels for the people of Ukraine, because we know what civil war and war between countries is all about. And we have suffered it, and we know. And I think, Debal, it's really, really critical for us to understand that we should not be hurrah, hurrah for Western propaganda that is awash in the media today. If you take a look at the BBC and take a look at even Al Jazeera, where a whole broadcaster was caught saying that this is not the Middle East and that these are middle-class civilized Europeans who are being bombed. Baghdad and Fallujah were more civilized than Ukraine. The largest universities in that part of the world and producing engineers was in Baghdad, the birthplace of civilization itself. So even in the media narrative, in the discourse of the media, you could see the blatant double standards, Debal, in which people in Africa and Asia are so used to that we feel for Russia precisely because of this thing. And I want to say lastly, Debal, that it is very important for us to understand one thing very clearly, that we ought to know that it is wrong that the people of Ukraine have been put into this position by NATO. They pushed them to the edge, and the people and the state of Ukraine ought to know by now that they cannot invite NATO to their country, and they cannot say that they're going to join the European Union because the world peace is at stake.
Thank you very much. All right, Peter Bierajak on this, and I want to gravitate the discussion also to that Warsaw Pact that we had Professor really discussing about. We lost your thought. Are you back yet? Peter Bierajak.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Well,
excellent.
You got disconnected at some point, and we've
yes.
moved. Yes.
Yes, unfortunately, let me finish the thought that I was saying before on the issue of racism. It's extremely unfortunate that what African students have been subjected to in Ukraine and on the Polish border is absolutely appalling. I was telling you about how racism is actually quite extreme when you go to Eastern Europe, and Russia is a part of the world where racism can really be exercised in your face. Just as I remember when I was also in Egypt, there is another one of the places where racism is really out of control. So it's quite unfortunate. And I understand, especially in the environment of war, there is chaos. Everybody is trying to leave. People are reduced to survival instinct, and everyone is trying to get out. But I also remember having grown in war and having lived in war, that war brings people together. because that is, you are reminded of your common humanity. So I really hope that this kind of behavior that we are seeing on the Ukrainian side as well as on the Polish side should be addressed. And I agree with the colleagues before that were saying that it is incumbent upon the African governments to summon the ambassadors of these two countries and have them really explain why African students are being singled out and being subjected to this kind of inhumane treatment. I saw earlier that the U.S. Africa Bureau issue a statement, as well as the Congress, the Senate issue a statement, the Committee on Foreign Relations, and I saw the statement from the African Union. But we need more countries to really summon the ambassadors so that this is explained and that the outrage is unanimous and is united. Now, on this issue of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, I think there is really a confusion, and sometimes there is a revision in history. I shared in our group, on WhatsApp group the other day, Gorbachev himself denying this notion that there were some promises that were made to him when the Soviet Union was dissolved, that NATO would not expand east. He confirmed it himself based on the interviews that he did, that there were no such promises that were made. In fact, the issue never even came up for a discussion. Then the second issue is this 1994 Budapest Agreement. What was in that agreement? The agreement had nothing to do with NATO or Ukraine future joining NATO. That was not the issue. The issue at the time was that Ukraine had the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, only after the United States and Russia. And Russia did not want an independent Ukraine to have nuclear weapons. So the Budapest Agreement was reached so that Ukraine can give up its nuclear weapons and be guaranteed that its sovereignty and its territorial integrity would be protected by everyone, including Russia, the United States, France, and Britain. This were the main grantors of that agreement. So that was what was in the Budapest Agreement. The other issue that I want to mention, the reason why you don't see NATO joining the war on the side of Ukraine and fighting Russia is because they don't want a nuclear war. No one wants superpowers and countries that have all these large arsenal of nuclear weapons to actually fight a war. This is why they are not joining. It's not because of anything else. So and if it is the issue of Russian border, we already have the Baltic state, Estonia, you have Latvia, you have Lithuania, Poland. All of them are NATO states. They are bordering Russia. If it is the issue of deployment of nuclear arsenal, it can easily be deployed in those countries. A missile can be launched in Vilnius, for example, in Lithuania, and it can explode in Moscow within 3 to 5 minutes. So that is really not the issue. The issue here is we cannot be talking about sovereignty and then at the same time say that this country cannot choose what it wants to do. They want to join NATO. No one forced them to want to join NATO or European Union. In fact, yesterday, the president of Ukraine signed a membership application to join European Union. No one is telling them join the European Union.
Thank you.
They themselves that are doing so. So are they independent? Are they a sovereign nation? Why should a sovereign nation be forced to consider the issues of other nations instead of...
Thank you, Peter Berejak. But I want to refer you to a document that now it has been declassified, where we had that particular pact on NATO not even, adding an inch to the Eastern Europe, as it were. And this is the record of conversation between Mikhail Gorbachev and James Baker. I want just to refer you to page 5, right? I'll flip over there to page 5 and read something. The conversation that we were having, this is a conversation between Gorbachev then in 1990 and James Baker. We'll begin from here. It says that that is Baker. If it happens, our troops will return home. Let me just begin with this last point here. Let me try and shade it so that you can see clearly and also expand it a bit. It says that, and the last point, NATO is the mechanism for securing the US presence in Europe. If NATO is liquidated, there will be no such mechanism in Europe. We understand that not only for the Soviet Union but for the European countries as well, it is important to have guarantees that if the United States keeps its presence in Germany with the framework of NATO, not an inch of NATO's present military jurisdiction will spread in an eastern direction. We believe that consultations and discussions with the framework of the 2+4 mechanism should guarantee that Germany unification will not lead to NATO's military organization spreading to the east. Let me continue to page 6, what it says there as well. These are our thoughts. Perhaps a better way can be found. As of yet, we do not have the German's agreement to this approach. I explained it to Jenscha, and he only said that he will think over it. Don't you think what you're saying then, it really flies in the face of this particular conversation between Gorbachev and James Baker way in February 1990, and now Russia has a germane reason of why they have to mistrust the US, because they are not keeping, the pacts and the agreements that it was there. Now they have NATO spreading their wings, want to rope in Ukraine. Let's hear from Dr. Hassan Khaneja, briefly.
Yeah, of course, those words are coming back, I think, to hound the West, and especially, Washington. James Baker was Secretary of State, under the Bush administration, and he was a very powerful and respected diplomat. Even though later on in the 90s, he actually, when he was, I think, interviewed, much later, back in 2014, I think he quipped that, well, I didn't expect the Russians were going to take it that seriously. Now, in diplomacy, commitments do matter. Now, with or without an agreement, and this is a point I'd like to emphasize. Big states or important states within their spheres of influence, which even people like Bernie Sanders have actually alluded to, the fact that Russia may take certain actions in response to its perception of threat, within its own sphere of influence. Countries such as Russia, or even let's use even Kenya, no country that cares about its own survival is ever going to allow an enemy state or an enemy satellite state on its door or on its borders. It just doesn't happen. And my brother Peter has raised the issue of Latvia and Lithuania. Yes, they're actually on the border with Russia, but we need to understand the geographical position of those countries in relation to Russia's own, at least calculations based on Putin, of its security interests. One is right there, close to the Russia's, one of the largest, fleet, down there, which means, at least in the assessment, placement of NATO forces is going to destroy the strategic balance of forces within Europe, which is going to constrain its own security. And so, if we simply talk about sovereignty without actually understanding national interests of countries, is going to be a challenge. Just as much as, for instance, Kenya, we live in a rather, delicate region, and it is unthinkable that Nairobi is going to allow, perhaps, a neighboring state to be used as a launching pad, for attacks or for hostile action. Yes. And so, going back to this agreement, of course, it's coming back to bite them. There's been a move by NATO to actually closer to Russia's, borders, in ways in which, of course, also not, I think, put in terms of the way Russians see themselves. That they've not been invited to join NATO. They're not being invited to join Europe, and therefore, naturally, they're going to think that this movement is against them, even though NATO is primarily a defensive body, collective security organization. But the move towards Russia's borders is seen in Moscow as a threat to its security, and therefore you're going to expect that. And that is why I think, even as Professor mentioned here, only a guarantee of neutrality for Ukraine will actually be able to ensure that Ukraine is going to remain relatively sovereign. Now, sovereignty is not complete. Let's face it. It is a principle. It is something we created in 1648 in the state formation. But it's never absolute. There are always going to be challenges to that, but that reflect the realities of the environment that countries exist, including Kenya, including Russia, including the United States.
Professor Midaba, briefly.
While I want us, my colleagues and also our audience, to remember two things. In the 60s, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union at that time was seriously weaker than United States. And Nikita Khrushchev and the rest later on realized how dangerous it was to provoke United States. When Nikolai Gorbachev came to power, Gorbachev was a realist. Gorbachev wanted peace for the world. And when he was confronted by President Reagan, when he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down the wall, because Reagan was really seriously committed to destroying the Soviet Union, as we know. He brought all the vintage ships, World War ships, back on board, and he said, all right, you want to fight, let's fight. And the Gorbachev was much more a realist than Reagan was. And he said, well, you know, let's back off, tear down the wall. But what he wanted to do, he wanted to go further than that. He wanted Europe and Russia to join together. And there was a very serious discussion beside what you just mentioned, such that Russia can become part of the state to protect peace, so that we don't have the nationalism rising up again in Europe, and you have Japan on the East Coast rising up because they are threatened. The idea was to protect peace, not to expand to each other's territory. So I want this point to be very clear to our audience. And then from there, the person, the leader of Russia, that has really characterized this thing and taken it further extreme than anybody else is the current President Putin.
Let's hear from Professor Kagwanja. He's taken it to the extreme, but he has valid reasons, just as Dr. Khanenje is putting it, the violations of this agreement. There have been consistent also, approaches from Russia to try and create a happy medium with the U.S. You can remember Gorbachev also speaking at the Congress, where he said, we are welcoming, the Americans or the USA to be our friends and partners. But even, the response from that was not really taken seriously at the end of the day. And so they're looking back in history and they're saying, we are not, welcomed here. They've been trying also to be, I don't know, you might tell me, to join the European Union. And of course, even that one has always not been a welcome sort of gestures from that particular community at the end of the day. So,
first and foremost, we must recognize that if Russia willingly disbanded itself as a protagonist in the Cold War, America built itself further. In other words, it did not demolish the foundations of the Cold War. And the existence of NATO, and this is where I added my other comment, NATO is the only existing legacy of the Cold War. And my view is that it should not exist in the first place, because it represents the hegemonic world order that was American. Why we are in crisis now is because America is on the decline. Trump could not defend or support NATO in the way the Americans had done before, and he did not have the same conceptualization of the importance of NATO in the world order. So NATO is the symbol of Western hegemony in the rest of the world. Now we are talking about NATO versus Russia. We have not started talking about NATO versus Africa when they invaded Libya and vaporized one of Africa's most progressive country in terms of economy. We needed to democratize Libya, but bombs don't democratize countries. Then we have not even started talking about NATO versus China. Because China is also interested in the Baltics and Eastern Europe because of its oil and the so-called maritime Silk Road. China is interested. So if we are really serious about constructing a peaceful world, NATO should be abolished. If we are serious on having equality of civilizations, where everybody is seen as equal, NATO must go. If we are really serious about world peace in a way that we negotiate and discuss our peace, then NATO itself is threatening. it should go.
It should go. You hold with the same view, Ahmed Hashi? NATO should be disbanded?
There is a concept called disciplinary neoliberalism hegemony. This is the unilateral thinking of American and European civilization, in which they believe there is a manifest destiny for them, in French, to civilize the world. Mission civilisatrice. And that we all have to go to a McDonald's, eat pizza, and get faxed the American Constitution. I want to put it to you, Debal, that we've had civilizations before the European civilization, and we hold our own truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, which is not really the example that has been showed by the American experiment. And Debal, we are not going to allow in our thinking this kind of unilateral acceptance of a discourse and a memory of history that excludes mine and the people of South Sudan, for an example, who are the builders of the pyramids, together with the Somalis. I think it's very important that we point out that Russia has had a civilization for 1,000 years, way before the American government was formed. And I think that we are witnessing in this moment a turning point in international relations, in which the financial arms of liberal hegemony, the World Bank, the IMF, and the international monetary system, the ascendance of English and American languages as the predominant world language, the idea that the Americans and the Europeans' vision of the end of history, as well as put by Francis Fukuyama, I think this kind of hubris is dead and buried, and it's not going to come up again, because the rest of the world is saying, no, we want a shared history. We want a shared world civilization in which other civilizations have informed these civilizations. I really want to point out the great Edward Said and his book Orientalism. If you really want to understand what is happening in the Ukraine right now, are people fleeing who supposedly want to join the European Union and its values of human rights, and abusing Africans at the same time. There is no disjuncture between the two. Those arteries are connected. And we in Africa's response, our response to this issue is, we ourselves don't want to have British soldiers in Kenya. We ourselves don't want to have American presence in our countries. We want to be able to build a state in Somalia, a state in South Sudan, and we need to get this whole region united under the banner of East Africanism. And after that, that is our own sentiment about what civilization we want. But we are not anti-American. There's nobody who's more, I admire more than the American experiment with democracy. But the fact of the matter is that we are not going to eat hamburgers, pizza, and read the American Constitution and become Americans here in Loitoktok.
All right, America. Okay, let's hear from Peter Bierajak. Briefly, also, we should be preparing our headline thoughts as we sum up. Peter Bierajak, so you want to respond to that particular statement or the conversation that was there in 1990 in February? I've read it to you. What would you say?
Exactly. And I was hoping, Debal, when you ask it, you would let me respond immediately. Let me remind you, this conversation, as you correctly mentioned, was taking place in 1990. In 1990, there was no Russian Federation. Most of the countries that we are talking about were still part of the Soviet Union. By that time, Soviet Union has not even collapsed. What was being discussed here was the issue of German unification and the placement of NATO forces within a united Germany. Because what came out of that work at that time was Germany would be united, and it would be united within NATO. So that was the discussion. This was not a discussion, a promise of not expanding east, because those countries were still under the sovereignty of Soviet Union at that time. Soviet Union did not collapse until 1992. So we have to really keep it in context. What was that discussion referring to? Now, I mentioned before, when we talk about independence, like us here in South Sudan, we have shared a long history with North Sudan. We were one country at one point. And when we became independent country, one of the first things that we did was to join the East African community, because we believe that this is really where our future lies. And there were people in Khartoum that didn't want us to do this. They didn't want us to be part of the East African community because they want us to be integrated and dependent on the Khartoum economy. And we see them as colonizers who have colonized us. It's the same way that the Ukrainians see Russia. What happened, Dubal, is unity is not only made by force. You cannot force me to become friend to you. It is interest that makes people friendly. And in the world economy now, what matters is trade. What is happening is the Western economy have integrated, they are more dynamic, they are richer. So the Ukrainians have become more integrated into the European Union economy. If you take in 2014, the largest destination of Ukrainian export was Russia. What is it today? European Union. Because Russian economy has not diversified. It's still reliant on natural gas and on oil and very little else. So you find in Russia billionaires, and then you find the poor people. So you cannot force people to be part of you or to be integrated into your part of the world without something that brings them that is much deeper. So this is the issue. Ukraine is a sovereign nation, and they are the one that want to join NATO, and they are the one that want to join European Union. What we are seeing today, unlike what Hashi is saying, I fundamentally disagree with what Hashi is saying. What we are seeing today is Russia has completely miscalculated this whole venture. They didn't expect the Ukrainian military to fight the way that it has fought. It did not expect the West to be united and to put the kind of crippling sanction that we are seeing today. If you look at the Russian rubles, now is worth only 1 cent. It has dropped by 30%. If you look at the Russian stock market, it has plummeted. In fact, they have even suspended trading until Friday for the stock market to resume. So you see, Russia will emerge from this conflict much weakened. And when you see this threat of nuclear weapon, what Putin is saying is, if I cannot win, because now even this convoy that is moving toward Kiev, it's unclear whether that convoy will even actually take Kiev. Because if you see how the Russians have been fighting over the last few days, many of these young people were conscripted. They did not join the war voluntarily. They did not join the military voluntarily. These were people that were conscripted. They were told that they would be welcome with flowers. Instead, they find that Ukrainians don't welcome them in their country, and they are being resisted inch by inch. Many of them are captured. A lot of Russian military hardware is destroyed. So this is a complete disaster for Putin.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. So let's bring it to a close, and just to get headline thoughts from you, Dr. Kanenje, Professor Naomi Damba, Ahmed Hashi, Kagonje as well, and finally Peter Bierajak. 30 seconds.
Yeah, the ghosts of Kosovo, the tragedy of Libya, and the falsities of 2003 invasion of Iraq is coming back to haunt the West and haunt us. Unfortunately, Ukraine has become a pawn in geopolitical power games. And as Africans, we should always seek a middle path that advocates for justice, the rule of law, human rights, and freedoms. But we should never really become echo chambers of one bloc or the other. Echo chambers of one bloc or the other. Thank you very much. Let's hear from Professor Naomi Damba.
The ball from the beginning of Pan-African movement to Martin Luther King to Black Lives Matters, to the treatment of our students in Ukraine right now, it points very clearly at one thing. Unless African put its institution in order and African respect Africans as people, we cannot blame the rest of the world for what is happening to us.
Thank you. Right, thank you very much. Ahmed Hashi.
The great philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who wrote the book Leviathan that every first-year student at the University of Nairobi knows about, argued that we need a Leviathan, a person who's a policeman of the world. I want to argue that Mr. Hobbes, a dead white man in London, was told no by Ibn Khaldun, the father of sociology and political economy and of history. And he says that civilizations inform each other, and they're not necessarily in conflict. And I want to disagree with Mr. Ajak's view of history, which simply says that we're all going to go to McDonald's drive-through, and that we're going to be liberal people who vote. And I think that there's more to that than we see. And I believe that we as Africans have a fundamental right to chart our own course, chart our own way in response to the other civilizations, and that we are not part of the American empire.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from also Professor Kagwanja.
Dibal, this forum shows how diverse we are as Africans in our minds, and I think it's high time we return to Pan-Africanism and begin thinking as one people and our interests. The events and experience in Libya, particularly for Africa, is very telling. The racism that went into that country and the racism now we are experiencing in Ukraine, and NATO is at the heart of it. My view is that we need to dissolve NATO and then start reconstructing world. There's no reason why one civilization should have used the military to assert its own hegemony over the rest of the civilization. Dissolve NATO.
Dissolve NATO. Right, thank you. Peter Biara-Jack, you hold the same view as well. Your closing remarks. Dissolve NATO? Briefly.
No, look, you cannot tell NATO to dissolve itself. That would make no sense. The Soviet Union was not dissolved voluntarily. It's because it failed. The model did not work. So what we do is not to tell NATO to dissolve itself or China to dissolve itself, is by us working the African security architecture and joining our bloc the way that we are doing now, making sure we are trading with each other, we are coordinating in foreign policy, and we are joining our defense together so that we build a continent that is actually powerful rather than telling others that they should not do this or this. Let us build our own power. And no one is going to tell us dissolve African Union because we want to keep it.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, our panelists. We really do appreciate. Dr. Hassan Kanenja, Director of the Horn Institute, thank you for coming through. Also, Professor Nomi Damba, Foreign and Defense Analyst. We really do appreciate you coming through as well. And Hashi, Senior Horn of Africa Analyst, thank you for coming through, Professor. Peter Kagwanja, the CEO of Africa Policy Institute, thank you for coming through as well. And also Dr. Peter Biara-Jack, President Revive South Sudan, thank you for coming through. Ambassador Rasas Mwincha was